Hi, everybody. Welcome to the lecture, Chapter 6, Late Tsarist Russia, the Russian Revolution, Provisional Government to the Bolshevik Revolution. So, this is a really big topic. This could be a lot of lectures, but we're going to try to do that in one. No time promises, but we'll see how we can do. Hope you guys are all doing good. Yeah, and let's jump in. So, get comfortable. Like I said, grab a beverage of choice. I have my chilled water right here. If I was home, I'd have some iced tea, but I'm at work, so I don't have that. But I do have some nice cold water. And have some tea after I get done with this. And I hope you guys are doing good. So yeah, get comfortable, get your laptop, notes, whatever works well for you. And let's jump in. So. All right, sorry you guys didn't see that, the rough transition. I had a student come by who's in one of my online classes, like you guys are, and I guess he wanted to see a 3D version of me, at least briefly. So I showed him a little bit of Roman concrete I got in Rome. That's for a 4A class, Early World History, and so we chatted for a little while. And then, anyways, that doesn't matter to you guys. Okay, so back to the prelude to the revolution. You guys got a bit of that in your reading for this week with George Gapon and Ivan Vazimov, The Works Petition to the Tsar. And Russian society, in many ways, is feudal into the 20th century. And I think I'll keep this brief, but this pyramid you guys see in front of you with the Tsar on top and the boyars, nobility, and the church right beneath him, it looks like something straight out of the French Revolution. As far as the class structure and the peasants, of course, grinding the mass majority of the population at the bottom. And that is correct in many ways. And not surprisingly, that system is creaking. It's a dinosaur from an earlier age, but it's in one of the large nations of Europe, of course, Russia, which technically is no longer a feudal nation. They had abolished serfdom in the 1860s. But in reality, Russia is in some ways technologically and with early industrialization moving into the modern world. But when it comes to any idea of rights of modernity, the rights of the citizen, any kind of voice in government, any idea of any kind of liberties that we in the United States take for just granted, are nearly foreign to nearly all Russians. So let's take a look at the prelude to this. So Russia had suffered a series of humiliating defeats, going all the way back to the Crimea War, which I referenced briefly talking about Ukrainian history and Sebastopol. And in that Crimea War, though, Russia will be defeated by a combination of Great Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire. Decades later, into the early 20th century, Russia will be humiliated in the war against Japan, the Russo-Japanese War from 1904 to 1905. Russia is stunned and humiliated to be defeated in fairly quick succession, both on the high seas and in the lands bordering Japan. Partly, I would say, it would be China. And Korea a little bit too. And Russia is humiliated in this. Russia at the time had been thinking about perhaps exerting greater influence over Korea. Korea in this time period was very vulnerable. It was not developed and not industrialized in Korea. Tragically, because my wife being Korean, by the way, I don't like to mention that to you guys, but Korea is very vulnerable. Russia is perhaps thinking of picking up scraps. So is Japan. China is eyeing a little bit too. Anyways, in the short version of that, Russia is badly defeated and humiliated by Japan. And that causes a revolution in 1905. This revolution is so serious that it threatens to bring down the Tsar in 1905. Some scenes here showing that, the large crowd of petitioners. And you guys read about that in 1905 from your textbook, as you guys know, asking the Tsar to reform. And very politely, by the way, when you read this, right, they keep saying We're simply seeking justice and protection from you, and release from the heavy taxations. We have no rights. We have no rights to the union. We have no liberties. We are enslaved. And they're not wrong. The Russian military and police responded with brutal violence, killing many of the peaceful protesters, and they were peaceful. That led to even greater anger among the populace, and it threatened to become completely unhinged. Worried about that, Tsar Nicholas II promises major reforms. But the event you've seen is referred to as Bloody Sunday. Of course, it's a much longer story, and I give you guys a very short version of it. But the massacre of the peaceful protesters there leads to the Tsar afraid that he will lose outright control. The population is so angry, and so he issues what's called the October Manifesto, which appeared, and you guys want to know this, to grant full civil rights to the Russian citizens and an actual functioning parliament, which Russia did not have, with real legislative power. On the surface, the October Manifesto from the Tsar Nicholas II looks quite good. It looks like dramatic, significant, democratic, liberal in context of rights, reform Russia to drag Russia really from its near feudal past and class structure into a modern nation with a functioning legislature and citizens with reasonable liberal rights. But in reality, it was a lie. In reality, Nicholas II made sure that when you read the fine print, nothing fundamentally had changed. Yes, there was a Duma, but Nicholas II was able to appoint the majority of people to the Duma, and even if in some case the Duma got out of control, he could veto any of its legislation, and there's no override of his veto. So he still holds on to autocratic power, despite there being the window dressing and now being elected people's representatives in the Duma, and that sounds nice, but in reality, very little has changed. And gradually it dawns on the Russian people that October Manifesto, which had sounded so good, turned out to be a facade, a Potemkin village. It's not real. And the liberal democratic social reforms that appear to be promised in reality do not take place. The old power structure is still very much in place. And of course, World War I breaks out. Russia, as you guys know, gets involved in the fighting on the Russian front between the Russians and the Germans, and the Turks too as well. Is brutal and savage and very bloody. And although Russia does have some successes at times during that war, overall the war goes quite poorly for Russians. For example, in 1915, the Russians suffered 2 million casualties. It gets so bad that eventually Nicholas II goes to the front to take direct command, although that doesn't help anything really. The Russian public sees the war largely as a bloody, ongoing wound and a failure. That increases discontent. There's Nicholas II and his family, and I know you guys are all very busy. You don't have time for this right now, but I recommend Robert K. Massey's Nicholas and Alexandria if you want to know more about the final days of the Romanov dynasty there in Russia. Robert Massey is a wonderful, popular historian. That'd be a really good choice right there. Fueling the discontent of the Russian people with all those issues already taking place. The failure to reform, the disastrous performance of Russia in World War I, the high casualties of the war, the grinding nature that war produces. Added to that, now the Tsar's at the front trying to take direct command. Again, that's not really improving the situation at all. Behind the scenes, the Russian public is also fascinated and disturbed by the figure of Grigory Rasputin, this alleged Russian mystic, self-proclaimed holy man and healer who is used by the royal family to somehow mysteriously or mystically or spiritually heal their hemophiliac son, Alexei, the young prince. And somehow Rasputin, even now we don't really have an answer for this, how he was able to help out the young boy who the family is desperately afraid may die at any moment if he gets injured, being a hemophiliac. And somehow Rasputin is able to calm him or help him. There's even today a bit of mystery about why that is. By the way, this whole story is so fascinating. I recommend that book, Rasputin by Douglas Smith. Be a good choice for you guys who want to dig in a little more into the spooky, fascinating, but as a story, we don't allow the word spooky to stop us from a careful examination of the evidence. And you see the subtitle for Rasputin, Faith, Power, the Twilight of Romanovs, of what is really taking place. Whatever probably the more mundane reality of what's taking place with Rasputin, in the eyes of the Russian public, many of them saw him as a malevolent or evil, almost like demonic influence on the royal family. He was an advisor to the Tsarina, with the Tsar Nicholas II, oftentimes at the front, fighting in World War I. Fighting, he's not commander, but he's as a commander. The Russian public feels that the Tsarina is now under the malevolent influence of this evil Svengali-like figure. Now the royal family in all Russia is shaking the reverberations of this evil influence of the royal family. And that just fuels greater anger to the Tsar. Eventually, famously, perhaps you guys know the story, Rasputin is assassinated or murdered. That story I'm not going to take time to go into, but it is fascinating and ghoulish and a mystery. Took a lot to kill him, if you guys know the story, but it took a lot. Rat poisoning and shooting and stabbing and drowning. He did not go down easily. Any case, I don't want to get sidetracked on that. But again, I encourage you guys, if you're curious about the story of Rasputin, I encourage you guys to dig in as a historian, to follow your muse, as a young historian, to dig deep and be curious. So, but that, even though Rasputin is now out of the picture, but the unhappiness with the royal family, the ongoing war has not gone away. In World War I, and its bloody footprints drags on, as you guys know. And eventually, all these streams of discontent bubble up. Some of them go back hundreds of years. Some of them are immediate. The humiliations of Russia, the facade of the October Manifesto, the impact of Rasputin and the failed war against Japan, and the failure of reform, and this bloody, just seemingly never-ending World War I, and the apparently incompetent leadership of that war of the Russian nobility and Nicholas II ultimately feeds into the mass revolt against the Tsar's authority, which we refer to as the March Revolution in 1917. Now, this revolution is broad-based. You see my notes here, I call it a liberal revolution. It's going to turn out that way briefly, but there are many, many different groups in this initial revolution. There's a wide variety of them. So, like a lot of revolutions, the initial toppling of the existing status quo of the government at hand usually have a broad range of revolutionary perspectives of what should come next. But they have the advantage in the early stages of the revolution that they all want the same thing, which is we're going to get rid of the king, or in this case, the Tsar, and his government. And so all these revolutionaries, of whatever stripe they may be, from liberal, conservative, and moderate, they can all work together, and that's what takes place in the March Revolution. You have Russian army units refusing to fight and coming back from the front, demanding change. They begin to join the revolution. Masses of workers go on strike. It escalates. The loyal army to the Tsar and the units are not big enough to deal with this. Many of them also defect, and pretty quickly things spiral out of control of the Tsar as revolution gains steam. Nicholas II, realizing, and this is March 1917, realizing that it's over, abdicates, which it's just recognition of reality. He is out of power. And the Duma declares a provisional government. That shows some Russian soldiers marching in support. There's Nicholas II unhappily realizing that his rule in the Romanov dynasty is over. Excuse me. And that's going to initiate what we know as a moderate liberal revolution or the provisional government. Provisional means temporary, right? This all happened so quick, they didn't have a chance for, say, like an election. They didn't. There's not time for that. Revolutions happen. What do we do now until we can find a more stable government? Provisional government takes over temporarily. Provisional government is relatively liberal. By liberal, we mean focusing on individual rights. And it's quite moderate in many ways. But it does pass core aspects of liberalism. For example, for the first time now, Russians are equal before the law. They're granted freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, right to unionize and strike. All those are core aspects of a liberal democratic system that you and I recognize here in the United States. So at the get-go, the liberal revolutionary government, the provisional government, makes major strides to bring Russia into a modern form of government. But crucially, there's two things they don't do that there was a very popular demand for, and that certainly socialists and communist groups, anarchist groups have been calling for. And the two things they don't do, and this is important, so make sure you guys write this down, is they do not redistribute land. Most of the typical Russian peasant, of course, own no land. Many of them are in a near serf-like status, working for the local boyar or landowner. Now, again, not technically serfs, but not too far removed from that, frankly. And they want land, and they don't own land. And while the socialists and the communists and maybe the anarchists are promising some redistribution of land, the provisional government does not do that. So there's still a simmering desire and anger among many of the peasants and lower classes that has not yet been met. Now, certainly they like some of the reforms, the freedom of religion, freedom of speech, right to assembly, right to unionize and strike. They like all those things, rights they did not have before. So the provisional government has done some good things, but they have not met this big demand for land redistribution. And additionally, equally big, perhaps even bigger, is provisional government feels like it must keep its commitment to the allied nations of Great Britain and France, and must keep the war going, as Russia had sworn to do. The war is deeply unpopular. That decision to keep the war going probably is fatal to the provisional government. The provisional government was dominated by the middle class and the liberal aristocracy, probably well positioned in a sense to rule, but perhaps not as sensitive and attuned to the masses of struggling Russian peasants and Russian industrial workers, and probably not as sensitive to their need for relief from the privations of their life. And the promises being made by much more radical revolutionaries in the form of the socialist and the communist, and later on once you get to the Bolsheviks and so forth. That's the first provisional president, Alexander Kerensky, there on the left. I should tell you briefly about Kerensky. When the Bolsheviks seized power in the October Revolution later this same year of 1917, Kerensky has to flee Russia, having been head of the provisional government. He realized it would be fatal for him to stay. He flees, eventually makes it all the way to the United States, becomes a professor, and will be teaching over at Stanford University as a visiting professor. And one of my good friends at the college, Professor Randall, some of you might know him, he teaches political science here. His wife, her father was also a professor over at Stanford, and her father was a colleague of Professor Kerensky, and Professor Randall's wife, as a young girl, was babysat a few times by Alexander Kerensky, which is just mind-blowing. That in 2023, my colleague, his wife, admittedly she was quite young at the time, obviously, she's a young girl, but was babysat by this guy right here, the last head of the provisional government, who fled Russia when the Bolsheviks took over and came to the United States. That's an amazing, strange and fiction. Oftentimes we look at these photographs of people, they seem like so distant, so far away, almost like they're not real people. Not a real guy. He was over in the Bay Area at Stanford teaching there. Obviously, we were very late at life, and Professor Randall's wife was a very young girl at the time. But you see, he lived in 1970, right? So he started doing the math, and Professor Randall's wife, as a young girl, they overlapped there. So, any case. Now here's where it gets a little more complicated. Now, the provisional government is nominally means to some degree, but not fully, nominally in control of Russia. But again, there's many other revolutionary groups, and they want a much more radical revolution to take place. Provisional government is quite weak. So they're competing with quasi-governments called the Petrograd Soviet. That would be what today is St. Petersburg. Petrograd Soviet is much more radical in vision and action. And they also want the revolution, but they want the revolution to go much farther than the limited liberal revolution that the provisional government was okay with and think is the best choice. They want a social revolution, distribution of land, end of the war. And they are quite strong, and oftentimes they're working against the provisional government in Moscow. So the provisional government, again, is not really in control of all of Russia. They're trying to be, but the revolutionary atmosphere, their strength is quite weak, frankly. And you have the competing other quasi-government in places, for example, in Petrograd, who are running on a different system. Army sees more desertion. Soldiers, again, do not want to fight this war. Peasants, many places, are not going to wait any longer. They've been hearing promises from socialists and communists, anarchist activists, and unionizers, and they know that that promise is land. The provisional government is not doing that, so peasants on their own in many places begin seizing land on their own initiative. In this very unstable brew and mix, in this environment, Lenin, who has rushed back, actually the Germans helped him back famously, you guys know, the Germans put him on a train to get him back, because of course the Germans are well aware that the Bolshevik, the communists and socialists went out of the war, and Germany, exhausted fighting the French and the British and the Russians on the Eastern Front, would like nothing better than to have the Eastern Front taken care of and dealt with and done at peace. And that way they could focus on defeating Great Britain and France. Well aware that Lenin has promised to take Russia out of the war, as you guys know, put Lenin on a special train and hurry him back into Russia. He arrives there in Russia in the tumult of the revolution. He arrives there, of course, in the provisional government's in power there, but he also realizes a lot of unhappiness in the provisional government of promises or ideas that the more radical revolutionaries have promised that the provisional government is not fulfilling and does not intend to fulfill. So seizing on the weakness of the provisional government and the happiness of the population, as you guys know, and you guys read some of this, right? You guys read Provisional Government Disarray. If you guys might skip that part, but you guys did read Lenin's What Is to Be Done. Trotsky arouses the people at Lenin's call to power. And Lenin and Trotsky and the Bolshevik leadership realizes now is the time to seize power. But let's talk about that. Let's talk about Lenin here a little bit. So, what is Bolshevik? When I was younger, I was always so confused by this. Like, what is that Bolshevik? What is that? So, remember, communism is a specific interpretation of the larger socialist vision. Remember, socialism and communism essentially have the same endpoint, which is a human utopia of absolute equality, socially, economically, racially, etc., right? So they have the same endpoint. So really, communism is simply a specific version or interpretation of socialism. Now, to drill down even farther, Lenin is the father of the Bolshevik Party. Bolshevik Party is a specific interpretation of communism. So communism, the theories of Karl Marx and Engels, but how you implement that, obviously, like any thought system, is going to rely a certain level on interpretation, strategy, and practice. So Lenin's party, the Bolshevik Party, is his specific, and it's not just his, but primarily Lenin's specific interpretation of how communism should function. His view of the party, his view of the revolution. So if that helps you guys. So Bolshevism is not separate, but it's a specific interpretation of communism. There's Lenin, he was born in 1870, died in 1924. Briefly, his brother had been a dissenting intellectual against the Tsar. His brother would be executed. by the way, executed for plotting to kill the Tsar. Not surprisingly, Lenin took that very personally. His beloved older brother being executed by the Tsar. Lenin himself was exiled to Siberia. Eventually, he's released from Siberia and goes into practical exile in Europe, where he begins studying Marx intensely. He'll return to Russia during that tumultuous year of 1917, during the early portion of the liberal moderate revolution, or the provisional government. With German help, he arrives there. Okay, the Germans helping them because they want him to preach his communist principles and take Russia out of the war. Now, what you guys want to write down right in front of you is, what are Lenin's core interpretations of communism or Marxism, right? Communism is kind of a umbrella term. Marxism is specific to Marx's vision, as you guys know. So again, don't get lost in all these terms. But his interpretation of reading Marx's literature, communist literature, but Marx specifically, because Marx is the original author, he's kind of the Bible, right, of what communist literature would be. And so in studying Marx, his interpretation of Marx is that, and you guys want to know these. First, only violent revolution will destroy the capitalism or old order. So Lenin's interpretation is like, look, although some socialists, perhaps some communists, imagine if you simply educate people properly, they'll realize that the communist or socialist utopia is a wonderful place for all humanity to live in. I maybe have to give up the 3 ponies in the backyard and having the 2 pools and jacuzzi, but if it means all my neighbors are all equal and I get to be in a safe society, just society of equality, I'm willing to do that, then I will. Another phone call. That's the downside of doing these lectures at work. Okay, in any case. So Marx says that's not going to work. The high class nobility, the people with the 4-car garage will never let that go. They're not going to. You're going to have to use violence. Now, if they voluntarily, some of them, maybe a small minority, might join you, be converted and give up the selfishness of exploiting their fellow human beings. Okay, great. But many of them will not do that, and they'll use all the powers at their disposal, the court system, the police, society, the media, and so forth, to crush your attempt to change things. So you are going to have to just be adults here. You're going to have to use violence to destroy that. I'm not so interested in the second one. That's a more specific aspect of his interpretation of Marxism, that if we get in really deep into Marxism, communism, that would be important. But for the sake of our class, we're not going to really get into number 2 there. But number 3 is important. Human leadership is the key. So Marx believes that, Lenin, and his study of Marxism, his interpretationalism, Marxism, Lenin's interpretation is that for a communist revolution to be successful, there has to be a highly disciplined party who's guiding and controlling the revolution and the path of revolution. And above all, that party itself must be guided and controlled by an elite core of Marxist revolutionary intellectuals and leaders. So you're going to have a very disciplined, cohesive party, and that party is headed by a core. That's what I'm trying. A core of deeply understanding, committed Marxist intellectuals who guide this larger party, and then by extension the whole nation and the larger masses of the world itself. So translation, this is not a democratic style organization. Now again, he might argue that a little bit, but Lenin's saying we don't have time for that. This is a battle. This is a war. This is a ship trying to steer between the shoals, the rocks. We don't have time for large-scale meetings and debating and discussions and stuff. We need a very committed core leadership that can rapidly, quickly make correct Marxist decisions, and then give that command to the party. The party can salute and rapidly do these things. And with that kind of strong organization, we have the power and the discipline to carry out what is needed in the incredibly difficult case of bringing revolution to the entire world. So Lenin arrives in Petrograd in April 1917. Of course, the provisional government is in power then, but again, the provisional government is quite weak. There's still simmering revolutionary feelings in Russia. There's still a lot of discontent in Russia. World War I is continuing. The bloodletting, the land has not been distributed. So Lenin realizes that and realizes that there's still a lot of energy out there that has not been expressed and changes that have been promised, and begins to agitate and work for a continuation, expansion of the radical nature of revolution that his ideology calls for. If you guys are curious on Lenin, this is an important subject, and you guys are all, many of you budding historians, although not all of you, many of you are. Some of these might be some good choices on Lenin. Again, depends how deep you want to get into, but the book on the left is the most recent by Victor Sebastian, Lenin the Dictator. Robert Service Lenin would also be an outstanding choice. And then some books I'll recommend for you guys on the right. But I want to give you guys a little tip right here as just take a moment here. So one of the nice things about the internet is if you see a book there, you're like, yeah, something interesting. Of course, you guys are busy, as I know. You guys are studying, you got work and family and friends and relationships. You got things to do, hobbies. So you might not have time to read an 800-page or a 500-page biography of Lenin right now. Maybe some of you can, but maybe some of you not. But what you can do, though, is you can go to YouTube and just look for the author's name, in this case, Victor Sebastian, put Victor Sebastian and then Lenin on YouTube. Oftentimes, you can find these authors discussing their book in like an hour format. Now, obviously, the book would have immensely more detail, but you can probably get a pretty good feel for what this author's core judgment of this individual or this incident or a place or time or event, whatever is. And so I do that all the time, by the way. I love it. YouTube is a fabulous resource for a historian. And by the way, for anybody, for a student like you guys, doesn't matter. If you see a book that looks interesting to you, again, it has to be relatively recent. So if these books are older, you might not find much. But these books are in the last 10 years, especially, some of them are a little older. Oftentimes, you could simply Google their name. Well, not Google, or you can Google, but go to YouTube, put in their name, put in the title of the book, and there's a really good chance you can find them doing a book talk someplace at some university, giving a presentation, a discussion, or a panel presenting their findings and their analysis of this issue. It's a fabulous way to hear brilliant individuals, specialists on these topics. I give you guys a 5-minute biography of Lenin. I'm guessing there's more to his story than that 5-minute version I gave you guys. Some real insight into his personality, who he is. And if you guys are curious, such a seminal, important figure in the 20th century, maybe an hour lecture or one of these brilliant professors and historians, writers can give you a real good feel for who these people are. Anyways, okay, that's my little recommendation for you guys. So, as you guys know from reading What Is to Be Done, Lenin says the revolution has not gone far enough. It's at a crisis stage, and it's time for the revolution to get much more radical. Much more radical. And that is the October Revolution / coup in 1970. It is a coup because the provisional government is kicked out of power, and the Bolsheviks, not because they're elected, not because the majority of Russian people authorize them to do this, but the Bolsheviks, through military force, are able to seize power. The provisional government is either executed or flees. Kerensky, as you guys know from me mentioning him earlier, obviously he fled successfully and got out. Eventually came to the United States, became a professor here. But it is a coup. And this is very important because the Bolsheviks seize control of the revolution. Now, there's many other revolutionaries. They're not just the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks are one branch of communism, in this case headed by Lenin. But there's other versions of communism. There's socialists, there's anarchists, there's liberal Democrats. There's a wide variety of other revolutionaries. But now the Bolsheviks have seized control directly of the government. And their plan is to implement a Bolshevik-style interpretation of the Russian Revolution. They're not interested in, we're going to have this broad coalition and we're going to listen to all the competing ideas from the socialists and the anarchists and other communists. No, it's going to be the Bolshevik interpretation, and we're going to have a monopoly on power. Obviously, that relies on power, discipline, and violence. The provisional government is kicked out of power, and now the Bolsheviks are in power. Now, when the Bolsheviks did that, though, they were quite careful initially. And you saw that with Lenin's piece, What Is to Be Done? Lenin does not say, we seize power so I can be in charge. He does not say that. He said, we're at a crisis point. Provisional government's not working. We have to do this. And so I'm seizing power. In fact, in that piece, you guys see this on page 103. He says, who must take power? This is not even important. That was his call, basically the night of, saying, it doesn't matter like who seizes power, but the revolution by this so-called revolutionary Kerensky and his provisional government, that's no revolution at all. That's a failure. And we can't wait to end the suffering of the Russian people and this chaos by seizing control and getting the real revolution going. Now, when he says we don't know who's going to take power, that's a lie. We know who's going to take power. That's Lenin and the Bolsheviks. But for the more naive or idealistic revolutionaries, you might not realize that initially. For example, if you're a socialist radical, or you're an anarchist, or you're a different kind of communist, like a Menshevik, which is the branch of communism, you probably, unless you're really probably more intuitive or have a real good grasp of history and human nature, which, by the way, you guys are working on being in a history class, you might not be aware that this coup that took place is not a broad-based radical coup of the more radical elements of revolution. It is explicitly a Bolshevik grab of power. Now, they are radical interpretation of a socialism, but they also are going to have all the reins of power in their hand. They're not interested in sharing power with other leftist revolutionary groups. And as promised, he quickly takes Russia out of the war, to the chagrin of the British and French, but to the happiness of the general Russian people. So Lenin fairly quickly, and the Bolsheviks fairly quickly make good on one of their promises, which is to end the very unpopular World War I, and they do. Additionally, they begin talking about redistributing land. Again, recalling one of the promises all the radical groups have been calling for. But of course, it didn't take long at all for other revolutionaries to realize, hey, wait a minute. Although at first we were excited thinking the Bolsheviks have seized power in the name of us all, but now as a large coalition, we'll have these large discussions and these conversations, and we as a mass movement can vote and like what's the vision for the Russian Revolution. We can put all our heads together, come up with a program for all of us to agree on after some deliberate process. No, the Bolsheviks are in charge. It does not take long for the arrest and executions to start of any of the groups. Not surprisingly, any of the other groups who are more conservative, and there's some groups who perhaps thought Nicholas II needed to go, but they did not want a radical revolution. So you have a whole variety of other groups, more moderates and traditionals, that are deeply unhappy with the Bolshevik seizing of power. And it does not take long at all before warfare breaks out between Bolshevik units and a whole coalition of various groups. We often refer to the anti-Bolshevik forces as the Whites. The Whites are not really all on the same page. Some of them want to bring the Tsar back. Some don't want the Tsar, but they want some new kind of government in Russia. But the Whites are a general whole coalition of anti-Bolshevik forces. Tend to be more right-leaning. They tend to restore some version of a more traditional Russia if they win. On the whole, that's not entirely. So the Bolsheviks now are fighting for their lives to maintain control, both against counter-revolutionaries who might want to restore the Tsar, or maybe people want to even bring back the provisional government. Additionally, they're trying to deal with people on the left. Now, again, they're quite careful with that initially of not to alienate the other radical allies, for example, other socialists and other communists. But it does not take too long before the Bolsheviks turn on anyone who they perceive as a threat to their monopoly in power. That's Leon Trotsky there on the left. There's Novotny on the right. Both of them are important, although Trotsky is more important to them. And civil war breaks out. Trotsky will behead the brand new Red Army, the Bolshevik army that's going to defend the Bolshevik interpretation of the revolution and to crush all the enemies of the Bolshevik Revolution. He's a very capable military commander. He's also a very bright individual and a world-class intellect. He's also has no problem using mass violence. Now, this is important, and we're getting toward the end of this lecture here, but we want to make sure we get this in here. Now, Lenin, remember when Lenin seized power, he did not publicly say we're seizing power in a Bolshevik coup. He didn't say that, right? He said we're seizing power in the favor of all the masses and our socialist brothers and our communist brothers and the peasants, everybody, that the provisional government was weak and ineffective and not getting the job done, a betrayal of our hopes of the revolution. But now, for the good of us all, we have taken the energy and seized power to make it a real revolution. And on the surface, it seems like he's going to make good on that. So he promises a constituent assembly in which all Russians would be able to freely elect representatives to the constituent assembly. And they do. The election takes place. And on January 18, 1918, the constituent assembly for the very first time assembles. And it turns out that the Bolsheviks have garnered less than a fourth of the seats in this brand new legislative body. Translation, less than a fourth, you are not the governing coalition. You're not going to be in power. You're not going to be in charge. Clearly, that's not what Lenin intended. As soon as they did a count, it didn't take too long to say, okay, that guy's a Bolshevik. That guy's not. That guy's not. That's a socialist. That's an anarchist. That's a Menshevik, different kind of communist. That guy's a liberal Democrat. And then, okay, there's a Bolshevik. They have less than a fourth. That is not a governing coalition that can control the government. But you still have soldiers, and you still control most of the government. So the Constituent Assembly met for one day, just long enough to do a head count and figure out we don't have the numbers. This government body, we would not control it, we would not be in power, and they shut it down. So if you are a socialist or an anarchist or a proponent of a provisional government, somehow are hoping for a new democratically elected majoritarian participation of the Russian people, that is over. Dictatorship is now obvious. Constituent Assembly, shut down. Close the doors, go home. By the way, what was your name again? Because we might come to visit you. Shut down. So if you're wondering, did the Bolsheviks seize the revolution for the benefit of us all, or did they seize it for themselves? Now they're running the revolution, there's no question. The answer, of course, is the latter, yes. The Bolsheviks are dictatorial running the revolution. All other revolutionary interpretations now are now null and void and likely to end in blood. The Russian Civil War was terrible and bloody. The Bolsheviks versus all the rest. It goes on from 1918 to 1920. It's touch and go, by the way. Even foreign powers, the United States, Great Britain, Japan, to a limited degree, get involved to try to assist the whites. Again, the whites is various coalition of anti-Bolshevik forces. The problem for the anti-Bolshevik forces is oftentimes they don't cooperate with each other. They do not do a very good job of working with each other. They have their own issues. They can be quite brutal as well. And the Bolsheviks have the advantage of it's just one party headed by Lenin, and Trotsky's a very talented military commander, and they're able to tap into that one system, united. Well, I guess not all Russia, but the Bolshevik party is pretty united, whereas the whites are a scattering of different interpretations, and ultimately, the Bolsheviks win this very bloody civil war. I say very bloody it was. Look at the numbers there. Anywhere from 5 to 9 million died in this terrible civil war. If it wasn't for the drama of the French Revolution and World War I and what comes on later in Russia, perhaps this terrible civil war would get even more attention. But oftentimes, it's to some degree almost passed over. Now, you guys know from talking about Ukrainian history, we talked about this, right? We talked about in fact, I'm going to show you the map right there. You can see some of the most dramatic fighting in the Civil War. Part of that takes place in Ukraine. Remember, Ukraine had declared independence when the Germans had occupied that. And then when Lenin had pulled out of World War I, remember the Germans actually controlled all what today would be Ukraine, as you guys know, right? So briefly, Ukraine had a brief window of independence. But of course, when the Civil War starts and the Germans, of course, World War I is now over, the German soldiers have all left, the Red Army is going to move into Ukraine and crush Ukrainian independence, and they ultimately defeat the whites. While this is going on, of course, revolutionary terror takes place. And that is, of course, the Bolsheviks eliminated any opposition to them. So obviously, anybody who's been the former provisional government, you better flee. You flee, you're probably going to die. Again, Kerensky saw the handwriting on the wall and got out, fortunately for him. But other people in the provisional government did not and were executed. So anybody involved in provisional government, not to mention any holdovers from the Tsar who were in any way considered suspicious, are imprisoned. Many of them were killed. Any strong opposition from the left, too. These could be socialist or anarchist or others who are too outspoken, too critical, anyway seen as a threat to the Bolshevik power and the Bolshevik autocracy. They are also arrested. Many of them are executed, too. The Cheka is formed this time period, which is Lenin's secret police. Cheka is designed to eliminate class enemies. Class enemies translates to anybody who the Bolsheviks have a problem with. Take a look at that. This is Lenin. Comrades, the Kulak uprising in your 5 districts must be crushed without pity. You must make an example of these people. Hang, and I mean publicly, so people will see at least 100 kulaks, rich bastards, and known bloodsuckers. Post their names, seize all their grain. Seeing all the hostages per my instructions in yesterday's telegram. Do all this for that miles around so people can see it, understand it, tremble, and tell themselves that we are killing the bloodthirsty kulaks and that we will continue to do so. And that's Lenin. And then P.S. Find tougher people. Means, look, shoot who you need to shoot, do what you need to do. This is the revolutionary terror we're talking about. I do want you guys to know this because you'll see this in the exam too. Let me have this for you guys. And we're getting close here to being done with this lecture. Kronstadt Rebellion. Now, as the Civil War progresses and the Bolsheviks increasingly take more and more control, as the Cheka is eliminating any kind of class enemies, any opposition to Bolshevik rule, frankly, anyone speaking the truth about what's really taking place anyway in opposition is eliminated. So, and also the war obviously is devastating. So, in order to fight this successfully, Lenin institutes called war communism. War communism is absolute power to requisition food, force workers to stay in their factories. It leads to a lot of hardships, many executions, in order to make sure that everyone in the Bolshevik-controlled areas is on their side, or Bolshevik armies move into areas not on their control to eliminate anybody there they see as part of the old establishment or a threat to them. It's a very hard time for Russia. Very difficult time. You guys are reading some of this. You guys read some of this with The Red Terror by I.I. Veritas and Alexei Babin talking about this. And you have the commander of the Red Army, Vasiliev, complaining to Lenin that, look, you got these political commissars in army units, and they're frequently grabbing some of our best former czarist military officers and with no evidence, shooting them, executing them. Like, look, I need these people. I need talented people. Meantime, these Bolsheviks don't know what they're doing, but these former czarist army officers do. But your political Bolshevik commissars in our units are running amok and shooting people and terrorizing them, and it's bad for the Red Army and bad for the cause. And you guys also read that piece later on the same piece you guys read by Alexei Babin talking about his diary of the depredations of the Bolshevik authorities in the villages where he lived. So not surprisingly that you have a significant number of leftist, socialist, or anarchist activists who are like, hey, wait a minute. I was totally on board with moving to a socialist utopia, complete class equality, economic equality, peace, prosperity, rights and freedoms and the good life. And man, that is not what we're getting. We're getting one-party control. We're getting a secret police that we're terrified of, the Cheka. We're getting people afraid to say what they really think because what you think could get you killed. We see poverty. We see peasants terrified and the grain being taken from them. We see workers forced into the factories and afraid to speak out. And they're like, this is not the revolution we fought for. We fought for the exact opposite thing. This sounds like what the Tsar used to be like, but only worse. And so you guys are revolutionaries, but what have you done? You've made this totalitarian system. And that's not what we fought for. I'm a revolutionary. I'm a socialist. And I want these things, but you've taken our vision revolution. If you made this police state with bloody claws, that's not what we asked for. So a bunch of sailors there in Kronstadt, many of them who have been in the forefront of the revolution back in 1917 against the Tsar, are deeply unhappy. Some of those, again, some are socialists, some are anarchists. They see what's taking place in Russia, and they're very unhappy. Life has not gotten better for them. It's gotten worse for them. And so they rise in revolt. You guys have given me to write that down. And that the reason why I'm showing you a battleship is that battleship will be kind of emblematic of the sailors calling for a return and taking the revolution away from the Bolshevik totalitarian control and creating a true revolution, restoring it to a true libertarian revolution. And many of those Kronstadt sailors are from this battleship, or sailors on that ship. I mentioned many sailors being on board revolutionaries. They're revolutionaries. That photograph you see on the left shows them early in the 1917 revolution, back in March 1917, when they revolted against the arbitrary control of the Tsar. So like, look, we're hardcore revolutionaries. We're socialists, we're anarchists, some of us are communists. So we were totally on board with the first part of the revolution. And when the Bolsheviks first seized power, we also supported them because we thought they're seizing them for the broader revolution for all of us. But it turns out it's not the broader revolution. It's the revolution as interpreted solely by Lenin and Trotsky, and now it's enforced by the Cheka, and you guys are ruling with absolute autocracy, and we're terrified, and people are struggling, and war communism has devastated us. And what happened to us having big meetings and voting and discussing things and what's good for the whole community? We don't do any of that. We simply receive orders from you guys. And if we don't do it, we get a knock on the door, and men in dark coats take us away, and that's the last we ever see that person. That's not what we fought for. So you guys take a minute right here, and this is what you guys are working on. So these sailors in March 1921 rise up in opposition to Bolshevik control. Again, these are not czarist forces. These are revolutionary sailors themselves. But they're like, this is not the revolution I fought for. I fought for workers' rights, and right to assembly, and freedom of speech, and fair distribution of things, and meetings where we can discuss our problems and vote on it, come to a collective decision. And we're not getting anything. Instead, we're getting Bolshevik, iron-fisted, autocratic power. And our social revolutionary dreams are not being met. Even worse, we're greeted with a violence level even the Tsar did not use on us. Yeah, you can see some of these things they're complaining about here. The Bolsheviks ruthlessly eliminate any opposition. Through the Cheka, they don't allow democratic participation in government. They take food from peasants. They run all sides with a draconian hand. Mass poverty, general suffering, fear of an arrest, and a bullet in the back of the head. All these things say the state is controlling our mind. We can't even freely express ourselves anymore. We didn't fight for any of that. This is like the old czarist autocracy, only worse. So the Kronstadt sailors raised in rebellion in March 1921 against Bolshevik control. Again, revolutionaries themselves, but they want a libertarian, democratic, as they would see, fair, respecting of the individual and the group revolution. That's not what they got from the Bolsheviks. They put out a manifesto, a list of their demands called the Pavlovsky Resolution, where they asked for a whole series of things to end to these revolutionary tribunals, into these detentions and these executions, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly for workers, etc., that they wanted. Essentially, they wanted restore personal and economic socialist style liberty, or libertarian socialism. So they still want socialism, but they want the individual voice to be able to participate freely in that without fear of retribution on them. Now, the sailors did not rise through an aggressive military campaign against the Bolsheviks. Perhaps naively they imagined if we put out our complaints, by the way, many of which the average probably Russian and under the Bolshevik system would have agreed with many of their calls and the resolution. But I think they naively imagined that would be spread to all of Russia, and there would be a mass movement to support their rejection of Bolshevik autocracy and totalitarian state control. But the Bolsheviks under Lenin and Trotsky leadership have no intention of backing down and relinquishing control of the revolution. They're not interested in negotiating with the Kronstadt rebels. Instead, they send in the Red Army. The Red Army goes in and crushes this idealistic and naive, but well-meaning, but idealistic and naive uprising of socialists and anarchists, leftist sailors there in the fleet there at Kronstadt, and many of them are killed in the fighting, and those aren't killed, they fled. Lenin realizes, though, that he is unnerved because these are fellow revolutionaries who rebelled against his authority, and so he does back off from war communism, institutes what we call new economic policy, and backs off against some economic measures of war communism, and allows a certain degree of small-scale capitalism to come back into Russia for the time being, and the Russian economy does stabilize. Here's some photographs here. That's a depiction of some of the Russian sailors there, Kronstadt sailors who were gunned down, summarily executed at the end of the fighting. That church on the right is from the Kronstadt Peninsula today, and that church in front of it, you see that this pyramid here, and that's recalling the martyrs of the revolution, and of course the Kronstadt sailors would be part of this. Could get fellow revolutionaries, but whose complaint against the autocracy, which is real, and the bloodletting of the Bolsheviks was all too real. But they naively imagine we can negotiate and we can roll this back, but they're deeply wrong. And as you guys know, they'll be eliminated. So the legacy of the Kronstadt Rebellion is crushing by Lenin's Bolshevik totalitarian state. This is a current piece of artwork here by a British anarchist group. Put an N in there. By a British anarchist group, where you see depiction of the Kronstadt sailors here, some of the anarchists and socialists calling for, as they would see it, the libertarian socialist revolution. That's mass based on the people, respects the people's rights within the collective. And then you see a depiction of the Bolsheviks. Now, them put kind of Ku Klux Klan, a star on, that's not what the Bolsheviks were doing, although Red Star they would be. But again, just to make the sinister feeling of what the Bolsheviks had done, and in the eyes of these anarchists, how they hijacked the socialist revolution into a Bolshevik terror state, and that they've hijacked the revolution, the language of the revolution, but they never brought the real revolution to Russia as they promised. So at the end here, significance of the Russian Revolution. It's the first attempt at the radical social and economic theories of socialism and Marxism. You can judge yourself how that attempt went, but violent revolution was a path to power. I remember that was Lenin argued. Lenin said you have to use violence, and certainly he did. Not just him, but the Russian revolutionaries did in very large numbers. Of course, that's going to frighten democracies around the world and the systems of government, seeing the violence coming out of Russia. Russia ultimately becomes a model for Marxist revolutions where you have one-party control, in this case Bolshevik control, headed by a dictator. Initially, it's going to be by Lenin, but ultimately by even much darker level, Stalin, and we'll get to that in a later lecture. But a controlled economy, elimination of privilege, distribution of land, elimination of class enemies, etc. So Russia, of course, is going to be the first model of what a Marxist revolution can look like. Now, from the get-go, the Marxists and various leftists argue over what happens in the revolution, and that argument has not gone away. Even now, there's arguments over to what degree was Lenin a bad guy or a good guy, and I'd say most of the most respected historians say Lenin's visions turned out very dark. Of course, that was not Lenin's intention. Lenin's intention, again, is a general socialist utopia. But it's also true that Lenin had no problem using mass violence, and not on just simply one occasion. Mass violence is part and parcel to the first stage of overthrowing the old order of being. And that will mean mass violence. Now, can you contain that mass violence? And can you contain the darker angels that unleashes, and also desire the human aspirational power to hold on to power, which the Bolsheviks absolutely did with an iron grip. They hold on to power, and using whatever tools of oppression to hold on to power against any kind of dissenting voice, and the mind and thought control that come with that are indeed totalitarian and very dark. The irony, of course, is what turns out from an aspirational utopia vision of making the world a place of peace, prosperity, equality for all. That is the vision of communism. but this supposed beautiful utopian vision turns into a very dark reality, not at all like that vision that they had promised the people. And with that, we're almost at the end here. I just want to recommend some sources for you guys. I recommend Anthony Beevor's Russia. That's a new book. There's a Revolution, Civil War, 1917 to 1921. By the way, you can find him on YouTube. Listen to many of his talks. He's a brilliant historian. People's Tragedy, Russian Revolution, 1891 to 1924 by Orlando Figes would also be a good choice. October by China Melville would be a good choice. Now, if you want to read how the Russians like to imagine revolutions themselves, that book here on the left by Leon Trotsky would be a good choice, because that's his version. Trotsky's a brilliant writer, theoretician. That's his interpretation of how the revolution went. Also famous, that book in the middle by John Reed. That's an American journalist, and he's very much excited by the Bolshevik Revolution and its potential. He wrote his classic book, 10 Days That Shook the World. Now, I would recommend that book to give you an idea of the excitement of leftists seeing the Bolshevik Revolution, what they thought that meant for the world. Tremendous excitement, optimism of this beginning of all human society moving to a utopia we can all embrace. That's not what happened, and John Reed's book is the naive excitement of what this could be. But if you want to get that sense of how people looked on it who were leftists, and their excitement and hope and of aspirations, putting hopes and dreams into what they thought was taking place with the Bolshevik Revolution in its very, very first days, John Reed's book would be an excellent primary source on that optimism. Then Robert Service's Trotsky, if you guys want to get, Trotsky plays a giant role in the early revolution. As you get Lenin, greater, of course, but Trotsky would be number 2. Robert Service does a very good job breaking down the complicated character of Trotsky, his brilliance, but also he's a true believer like Lenin, and so he has no problem using great quantities of blood to construct the utopia. The ultimate Trotsky is going to break off from Stalin and Stalinism, and that's for another lecture. But that's enough for this one. So some recommendations for you guys. I encourage you guys, if you're a young historian, to work on a library and hold on to your books. And I'm going to stop right there. So hope it's good for you guys. We'll see you with a next lecture next time. So take care, everybody.